Well, hello, folks. I hope you enjoyed your weekend. It's raining here in Normandy, so I haven't had a particularly good day. It's just been chucking it down all day. But this is the first show of our Battles at Sea week, which takes us to the Atlantic, to Arctic convoys, and across the various theatres of World War II. But tonight we're starting off with an examination of the Battle of the Atlantic, which is arguably the longest campaign of World War II because it spanned the entire war, really, and certainly one of the most important. And my historian, he was a guest on a Battle of the Atlantic show we did this sort of time last year, one of the early ones that I can't bear watching now because it's so clunky and I'm not very good. But he's come back a year later to talk about the Battle of the Atlantic again. So Brian Walter joining us from the USA. Good evening or good afternoon, Brian. How are you doing?
I'm very fine, thank you.
So this is the thing about the Battle of the Atlantic is that I'm British, you're American. You were an army captain, and now you're writing about the Navy. But I, as a Brit, the Battle of the Atlantic, it's all caught up with that same mythology and legend of Horatio Hornblower and the Cruel Sea film and comics, and we have this image of the duffel coats and the mugs and the sea crashing over the bow of ships, things like that, and it's hard sometimes to pull away from that mythology and actually get down to the facts of the issue. And so what we're going to look at tonight is the facts. But before we do that, as I just said there, I kind of gave it away. You were in the US Army and you're an American. Where did your interest in studying the Battle of the Atlantic come from?
Well, it's kind of an interesting question because in my case, when I was in fourth grade, many years ago, I came across the book about the Battle of Britain. And at the time, I didn't really know much about it. I mean, I think I'd heard of England. I didn't necessarily know that much other than the fact. I found out when I'm reading the book that Britain is in fact an island. And for whatever reason, that book just had a life-changing impact upon me because I've been fascinated with the British military during World War II ever since. So this was, some 50 odd years ago when I read this book. And for whatever reason, it had this impact upon me. I've been a student of the British military during World War II, ever since then. And more recently, I've had an opportunity now to start writing and get my first book published. So it really stems from that and just the fact that I've been a lifelong student of this subject.
And it's interesting, I was talking before we went live, I was talking about Alan Allport, who's been on a couple of World War II TV shows. So he's a Brit from Liverpool who now teaches in the USA and been there 20 plus years. Do you think that perhaps it maybe takes someone from outside of Great Britain, so an American historian or a Brit who lives overseas, to kind of self-examine the era with kind of that neutrality and objectivity? And because in Britain we all have to filter all our reactions to Churchill and the Battle of Britain, all these misconceptions, and people like Boris Johnson and what have you still use World War II sort of slogans and references all the time. And England are playing Germany tomorrow night in the Euros, and of course both Germany and England will be playing on all the World War II sort of images, pretending that they shouldn't do it, but all at the same time it's always that backs against the wall Dunkirk spirit. So, do you think that perhaps it needs someone from outside to look at it and give it that objectivity?
Well, I certainly don't think it hurts. I think, the whole point is you just have to approach this from an objective point of view. And I'm not saying that, a native can't do that. But I think that a lot of times, people come with an agenda that they're trying to advance. And one of the things I tried to do when I wrote my book is just lay out the facts. This is what happened. I'm not trying to prove a specific point. I'm just trying to convey to the readers, this is what happened. And then they can draw their own conclusions to this. And I'm very much a facts and data guy. And so, a lot of my opinions are drawn from the facts and the data. And I think that'll come out a little bit in this presentation. Because when you do it that way, I think, things become very apparent in some cases that don't necessarily go along with the conventional wisdom or what people think they know about this topic, when in fact, when you look at the data, you realize that's not really the case.
Yeah, and we discussed it in our pre-chat yesterday that I found that some authors will use various ways of using statistics that make things sound more dramatic. Because with the naval campaign, you can use the loss of tonnage, you can use the number of ships, and sometimes it seems to me they're choosing a particular way of getting across their information to make a dramatic point. So when they want to use tonnage, they will. When they want to use number of ships, it's all done to, or not sort of manipulate the reader as such, but to to sort of reinforce this point that they've got this agenda. And I say you're coming at it from a factual point of view. But anyway, let's start off. And we've got, as usual, if people have got questions for Brian, then put them in and I'll put them up on screen. But we'll kind of hand over to Brian, and then I will jump in when people have some questions. So let's talk about the Atlantic campaign, and I'll hand over to you.
All right, very good, very good. Well, primarily during our discussion today, we're going to be talking about some of the major turning points during the Battle of the Atlantic. But before we do that, I think we need to have a general overview about the Atlantic campaign and why this was so important. As Paul alluded to, this was the longest running campaign of the Second World War, at least as far as the Western Allies are concerned. Somebody did recently point out to me that China was actually involved in the war longer than we were, which of course is true. But at least as far as the Western Allies are concerned, this is the longest running campaign of the war. It starts on the 3rd of September, 1939, and doesn't conclude until the 8th of May, 1945. So almost a 6-year stretch. In terms of scope of the battle, just to give you one example of that, there are more ships that are sunk in the Atlantic theater during World War II than in all the other theaters combined. And, I, as an American myself, over here on this side of the pond, we tend to be very focused on the Pacific. But the truth of the matter is that the scale of the fighting in the Pacific, while it was very intense, it still wasn't on the same level that occurred in the Atlantic. And then finally, the relevance of this battle. And in my mind, this is the most important factor in terms of why this is the premier naval campaign of the Second World War. And it's actually the most important campaign that's waged by the Western Allies during this war, because essentially it's the catalyst for the entire Allied war effort. Nothing else is going to happen without success in the maritime realm. There is no North Africa campaign. There's no invasion of Italy. There's no strategic bombing campaign. There's no invasion of Normandy, and there's no Northwest Europe campaign without success in the Atlantic and in the maritime realm. In fact, there's no Western alliance, because without ability to control their seaborne lines of communication, Britain will fall. And without Britain, even if the United States comes into the war, it's going to be exceedingly difficult for them to wage any type of effective war effort against Germany without Britain as an ally. And then they still have to get the resources across the ocean. So, short of the use of nuclear weapons, which might have been a possibility had things turned out a little bit differently, this is the catalyst for the entire Allied war effort in the West. And it really should be the starting point of any understanding of this contest in Western Europe.
Yeah, and I made the mistake of saying a British story, because I was talking about it from a British point of view. Darren Little, whose grandfather was everywhere in World War II with commandos, is saying, of course, it was an American battle as well, and very correctly pointing out that the USA was involved in the Battle of Atlantic before you were actually at war as a country. It was that whole Lend-Lease thing begins, and the support and shipping. So it's the definition of an Allied campaign, because as I say, you were involved before you were even involved. It was that important. And I think understanding that importance of it is key for tonight's presentation, but also, as I kind of alluded to on Twitter today, that it perhaps wasn't quite the close run thing that we think it was. But that's what we'll get into as we're going through the presentation. But we'll move on. So I'll hand over to you to carry on.
All right. So very quickly, again, we're going to talk about the various roles that were played on the competing sides as far as our maritime forces were concerned. As far as the British are concerned, there are 5 major roles that they execute during the Second World War as far as their maritime services. You have the first is to defend Britain against direct assault. The second is to secure vital seaborne lines of communication. The third is to impose a maritime blockade against Germany. The fourth is to support the needs of the army, and they will do that through a variety of different ways. And then the final one, which is a role that's adopted once the war is underway, is to provide logistical support to the Soviet Union. For their part, the Germans have 3 major roles that they will assign to their maritime forces. The first of those is to interdict Allied lines of communication. The second is to secure their own maritime lines of communication and a degree of maritime trade, which is a factor that's often overlooked. But obviously Germany wasn't as dependent upon overseas trade as was the United Kingdom, but it still benefited from it, particularly when it came to resources coming from Scandinavia, which were critical to the German war economy. And at a minimum, they wanted to be able to facilitate that Baltic trade. And then finally, again, the Germans are going to use maritime power to support the needs of their own army, which is manifested itself in the invasion of Norway. And then subsequently, they will use maritime power to support operations against the Soviets. They'll use it in the Mediterranean. So those are the various roles. Now, one of the things I want to point out, and again, this is maybe, let's remain back on the other screen for just now.
Sure.
In my mind, there's a distinction between the Atlantic campaign and the Battle of the Atlantic. Basically, the Battle of the Atlantic is rolled into the Atlantic campaign. When you look at these different roles, you can see that only one on each side actually pertains to the Battle of the Atlantic. And that for the British is securing their vital seaborne lines of communication. And for the Germans, that's trying to interdict this. And this is the most important aspect of the Atlantic campaign. But I just want to point out that there are other things going on in the maritime realm that are also very important to the eventual outcome of the war that go beyond just the scope of the Battle of the Atlantic. So,
yeah, and I think we're just referencing, someone just said, of course, we concede the fact that the Soviet Union won World War II, and I'm not going to argue against that, although, as you just point out there, the logistical support the Soviet Union get from the other allied nations is integral to their ability to wage that war. So, these things always tie together. Yeah, and I know there's been some sort of, for the last few years, this insistence that, of course, everything that happened in Normandy and Italy was pointless compared to what was happening in the Soviet Union. And they're kind of dramatic statements to make that have some truth behind them, but it's all tied together. You can't separate one from the other. The Soviet Union's role and relationship with the other Western allies is integral to their success and our success. You can't treat them as entirely separate campaigns because they have this link.
Well, I think we could have a whole different show on that subject, but I actually think that the Western Allies made major contributions to the defeat of Germany, and I will probably touch upon that at the very end of our presentation.
Sure.
But again, right now, I guess the focus is on the Battle of the Atlantic.
Yeah.
Now we can advance to the next slide, please. All right, so now we're talking about the Battle of the Atlantic, and again, a little bit more background. We're going to take a look at from the British perspective why this is so absolutely important. All right, and the reason it's important because Britain's an island, and 80 years ago, as of today, Britain was not and is not self-sufficient on a variety of different necessary resources. Amongst these is food. During World War II, the British only produced about half the food that they consumed. And so in order to support the British nation, the society, the economy, and their ability to wage aggressive war, they needed a degree of seaborne imports in order to make up the shortfalls that they couldn't produce locally. Now, in 1938, the year before the war began, total seaborne imports into the United Kingdom amounted to 68 million tons. And the British realized, once the war begins, that they can reduce that requirement through rationing and through some domestic production, like the Victory Gardens that will spring up around Britain. But they can't entirely eliminate their need for seaborne imports. And in fact, they established an absolute minimum of 27 million tons of seaborne imports that they need per year in order to support the vital needs of the nation. And that's more or less just to survive. Of course, if they want to engage in a robust war effort, they're going to need to bring in more than that. But at a minimum, they need 27 million tons to stave off starvation and keep the society functioning. Now, one thing I like to point out is, again, when we're focusing on these vital seaborne lines of communication, we tend to solely focus on the convoys that are arriving in Britain, bringing this life-giving sustenance to the nation. But we also have to understand, in order for Britain to wage war, they're going to use similar lines of communication then to wage war in North Africa, in Southern Europe, in Northwest Europe. This all depends upon seaborne lines of communication in order to move their resources to be able to conduct these operations. So this is kind of rolled into this as well. Now, from the beginning of the conflict, the British they adopt the convoy system. Now, during the First World War, the British had been reluctant to introduce convoys, but once they did, they found them to be immediately effective. During the Second World War, they don't hesitate. They immediately introduce, in the first month of the war, a convoy system. As we'll discuss shortly, this was far from a complete convoy system for the first few years of the war, but by the time you get past the latter half of 1941, pretty much everything that is flowing across the Atlantic is doing so in protected convoys. And this will really be the cornerstone of British defensive policy when it comes to their lines of communication. And then finally, the British have three major assets when they go into the war that are going to assist them in this struggle. The first of these is that the British maintain the largest merchant fleet in the world at the time. And again, I'm including it in Commonwealth contributions, but overall, they have almost 18 million tons of merchant shipping at the beginning of the war. This is more than twice the size of their next largest competitor, which is the United States. And it's a merchant fleet that's roughly 4 times the size of the merchant fleet that's available to Germany at the beginning of the war. They also have the biggest Navy in the world with the Royal Navy, with the United States a very close second. And then finally, of course, Britain at the time, the head of a global empire, has a global logistical infrastructure that's already in place that is going to pay dividends during the course of this battle. So again, three major resources that the British have at the beginning of this battle.
I just want to underline that point about how much the UK relied on imports, because I think, again, this doesn't sit with the common mythology of the Britons standing alone and we're an island nation. We are, but we rely completely on outside help. And I was checking my data today, and I'm finding that it's between 70 and 85% of Britain's food was coming in the 1930s and overseas. I couldn't find a definitive figure. Oops, excuse me, windy pops. I was looking at various sources there, but it's a staggering amount. And then, as you said, during World War II, it goes up to that where we're producing half of our food. But it could have been as low as 15% of our food we're producing ourselves, which for a nation considered as, the gardeners and the green fields of England, it's a staggering point. I think people from outside of Britain aren't aware of, and I don't think enough British people are aware of how little we were producing of our own food, and still aren't really. Sure,
absolutely.
So yeah, we'll move on.
All right, very good. All right, from a German perspective in this battle, the Germans realized after the summer and autumn of 1940, when they failed to subdue Britain, that their best opportunity to drive Britain out of the war is through a maritime blockade. And in August of 1940, the Germans declare a full blockade against Britain. But it isn't a direct blockade or a close blockade as sometimes we would think, because the Germans simply don't have the naval power to be able to enforce such a thing. So it's more of an indirect blockade. And the target of this is the British and Allied merchant fleets. The Germans hope to basically, they adopt a tonnage strategy, where their idea is they're going to sink British and Allied merchant shipping anywhere that they can find it around the world, with the idea that over time we're going to trick this merchant fleet, sink ships faster than they can be replaced, till we get to the point where it's no longer capable of supporting Britain's import needs. And then the whole thing will collapse. And in order to do this, they set a initial goal of 700,000 tons a month that they believe they need to sink in order to cause the type of attrition against the British and Allied merchant fleets that will be necessary to eventually achieve the goals that they're attempting to attain. The Germans are going to use a variety of weapons, and we'll get into this a little bit later into the presentation during the course of their efforts to interdict these seaborne lines of communication. But the weapons that will come to the forefront and will be the dominant weapon during the course of the battle is, of course, the U-boat. All right, we can move on. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit about those weapons that were available to each side. As far as the British and Allies are concerned, we'll start with the ships. When Britain starts the war, as I said, they have the largest navy in the world. This includes, at the beginning of the war, a total of 168 destroyers and 53 assorted escorts that they have within the Royal Navy. In addition to this, and with some contingents within the Commonwealth. In addition to this, of course, they have hundreds of additional vessels that are under various levels of construction when the war begins or have been ordered. This includes in 1939 a total of 116 Flower-class corvettes and 56 anti-submarine trawlers that are ordered. And then as the war goes on, the British are going to continue to build additional escorts, as are the other Allied nations. The bottom line is, at the end of this contest, several hundred Allied escorts will have engaged in the Battle of the Atlantic, maybe over 1,000. And many of these will be destroyers. But as the war goes on, you're going to have purpose-built escort vessels that are primarily taking over this task. One of the most prevalent of these purpose-built escort ships is the Flower-class corvette. I have a picture on the top right of a Flower-class corvette. These weren't particularly accomplished vessels. They were limited in what they could do, but they were inexpensive and they were easy to produce, and the British will produce a lot of them, and they will be, a cornerstone of the British convoy defenses for a significant part of the war. Now, as the war goes on, the British and the Allies, the Americans, will produce a number of other different escort classes. Again, some of the different types I've got listed here. One of these things is the escort carriers, which will come into dominant use in the latter half of 1943 and thereafter. Again, escort carriers, and I have an example of an escort carrier on the bottom right. they give escort commanders their own integral air component, and these, of course, will play an important role in the Battle of the Atlantic. Next, okay, there we go. Now, it's also important to understand that this was not just a naval conflict, but that the Royal Air Force and its Commonwealth and Allied counterparts were also participants in this battle. Now, for the Royal Air Force, of course, the major command that will be associated with the Battle of the Atlantic is Coastal Command. And again, during the course of the war, as you get to the latter parts of it, there will be several hundred British aircraft that will be operating within Coastal Command directly related to the Battle of the Atlantic. And some of the key types that are used include the short Sunderland, which was a flying boat, and I've got an example of that on the top right, which was the most capable anti-submarine aircraft that was in Coastal Command's inventory at the beginning of the war. And this will see service throughout the conflict. And then also you've got later aircraft that come along, including the Liberator aircraft, which is produced by the United States, and an example of that is on the bottom right. The Liberator is actually the most effective of the different aircraft that the Coastal Command will use during the course of the war. It's capable of very long-range operations, and eventually Liberators will be responsible for the destruction of about 70 U-boats during the course of the conflict. Now, in addition to Coastal Command, Bomber Command will actually interestingly play an important, although indirect, role in this contest, particularly in the last year and a half of the war, where large numbers of U-boats will be sunk during Bomber Command raids against ports and production facilities. And also, the 8th Air Force is also involved in this. And through these bombing, direct attacks, and mine laying activities, again, a number of U-boats will be sunk during these operations, but also it'll impede German industrial output in trying to produce U-boats at the end of the war. So again, in an indirect role, Bomber Command actually plays an important contribution to this contest as well. Next slide, please. As far as the Germans, as I was indicating before, the Germans are going to primarily depend upon their U-boats. They start the war earlier than what Hitler had assured his admirals that the war would begin. And as a result, the Kriegsmarine is not necessarily in the position it wants to be to confront the Royal Navy. At the beginning of the war, the Germans possessed 7 capital ships, 8 cruisers, 33 assorted destroyers and torpedo boats, 57 U-boats, and 10 escort vessels. And of course, they have other vessels that are under construction at this time too. Now, some of these heavier warships will play a role in the Battle of the Atlantic, at least early on, but primarily it's going to fall upon the U-boats to conduct this operation. Now, Admiral Dornitz, who was the head of the Karl Dornitz, who was the head of the U-boat command, believes that he needs 300 U-boats in order to be effective against the Royal Navy. And obviously, he doesn't have his 300 U-boats. He has 57. And that's a bit of a misnomer, because of those 57 U-boats, most of these are Type 2s, which were coastal boats that were really not capable of operating into the, deep into the Atlantic. So the total number of U-boats that he has available that can operate into the Atlantic are 25. So he's got 1/12 of the force that he believes that he needs in order to conduct this battle effectively. And it will take a fair amount of time for him to build up his forces. Basically, it will take almost 3 years for him to eventually build up to the point where he has this force of 300 U-boats. So the Germans start out in a somewhat weak position, but I do want to emphasize, and they don't build up necessarily quickly, but eventually they will build up to the point that throughout the duration of the war, the Germans will eventually acquire almost 1,200 U-boats. So they will build a very substantial navy to engage in this contest, but they don't start out with this, and it takes them a bit of time to build up to this level. Now, again, there's different U-boats that the Germans will use, but the primary U-boats that are engaged in the Battle of the Atlantic are the Type 7, which is a smaller, medium-sized U-boat, and a Type 9, which was a larger, longer-range U-boat. I've got a picture of a Type 7 and a Type 9, and you can see, the size differential between the two of them. And these will be the mainstays in the entire German U-boat effort during the course of the Second World War. As we'll talk, later in the presentations, the Germans will develop a revolutionary new category of U-boats with the Type 21s and Type 23s, but these will come too late into the war to have any impact upon the battle. The Germans will put great emphasis in the last couple years of the war to try and produce these boats. And again, thankfully for the Allies, they never really come in time to have any impact upon the battle.
And I just want to jump in there, Brian, and reinforce the idea again that this fact, the Royal Navy had a lot of ships and the German Navy had less than it was hoping for. Again, that doesn't sit in with the popular narrative. It's the same with the Battle of Britain. We like to believe that we didn't have enough Spitfires. The Luftwaffe was dominating all enormous force, and that we just about held our own in the Battle of Britain. And in fact, what we've come to understand with the Battle of Britain, and we've done this other shows about this, is that we had a very, very prepared system of observer corps, and we had the Royal Navy up in the Jutland, and we had this, and we had that, and we had Spitfires on production, Arrogans, and we had a big system in place, and the Germans were never likely to kind of, defeat us in the air there. But that doesn't sit with the way we tell the story. So the same with the Battle of the Atlantic. I feel the way it's presented is that we are the weaker part of it, and the Germans have this massive, great force, and that we're starting off on a dangerously outnumbered stance. And the point you're making is, no, we're not really.
Yes, and that's true. Of course, then again, you have to remember that the Royal Navy has multiple obligations that they have to fulfill, true. And so they are never able to put all of their effort into just the Battle of the Atlantic. And in certain categories of warships really not effective in this type of battle. So I mentioned before, when I talked about the Royal Navy, I just talked about destroyers and escorts, because by and large, battleships and cruisers aren't going to play that type of role inside of this battle. But yes, you're absolutely right that when the war starts out, the Germans are not in an ideal position as far as their Navy is concerned, and it will take some time for them to build up. But I also want to emphasize the fact, though, that they will build up a very substantial Navy. And one of the things I've pointed out in the past, and this is just raw numbers, is at the end of the day, the Germans will actually accumulate a Navy that's twice the size of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Now, the Imperial Japanese Navy has more aircraft carriers and battleships and cruisers, but just in terms of raw numbers, the Kriegsmarine is twice the size of the Imperial Japanese Navy during the course of World War II. So we shouldn't undermine the emphasis that the Germans do eventually put into this naval effort. It involves about 10% of their overall military production during most of the war goes into naval applications, of which most of this is shipbuilding, of which most of that is U-boats that they're trying to construct. So it takes them a while, but they eventually do build a very robust Navy.
Right, moving on.
Okay. All right, so now we're actually going to get into the conflict itself. All right. The war starts in 1939. For the first 7 months, it's called the Pony War period of time. Obviously, there are activities going on in the naval realm, but mostly it's just kind of a status quo thing. Both sides probably have some reason to feel that they're advancing their own roles or objectives that they're trying to do. And then you roll into April 1940, and everything changes when the Germans launched the Blitzkrieg campaign against the West. Within a period of a little more than 2 months, the Germans conquer France, the Low Countries, and Norway. And this changes the entire complexion of the war in the West. For Britain, it's catastrophic because they start the war with a major ally in the form of France on their side, and they have these buffer nations between them and Germany. And now, all of a sudden, within a 2-month period of time, France is gone. Britain is devoid of European allies, and a massive German army is just a few dozen miles across the English Channel. And for the first time, basically since the Spanish Armada threat, the British are face their greatest threat of losing their independence. Again, for several hundred years, and they're weighing the threat of invasion. Now, of course, the invasion never occurs. A big part of that is because the Germans never achieved the prerequisite air superiority that they believe that they need in order to launch an effective invasion. And of course, the kudos for that go to the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain. And while I'm certainly not going to say anything derogatory about the Royal Air Force's performance during the Battle of Britain, I would nevertheless submit that it was the Royal Navy that was the primary deterrent to this German invasion in the summer and autumn of 1940, or to be more specific, it was the strength of the Royal Navy as compared again to the corresponding weakness of the Kriegsmarine that was really the decisive factor here. Nevertheless, Britain survives. This is the first major strategic check of the Germans during the Second World War. In my mind, it's the most important turning point of the Second World War because it ensures that there's going to be an effective Western alliance that's going to wage war against the European axis. But as you get yourself into that time frame, yes, Britain has survived, but this is still an extremely tough period for them. And one area that this is tough is in their Atlantic struggle and securing their maritime lines of communication. There are a number of factors that are going to contribute this period, which will stretch for 9 months, which is originally called the happy time by the Germans. I'm only going to really address two. One of these is with the fall of France. Germany now has access to the French Atlantic ports, and they will immediately begin operating from these French Atlantic ports in the Bay of Biscay, which puts them in position to reach out much farther into the Atlantic than had been the case, earlier in the war when they were operating out of Germany. The second factor, which is actually more important, is the British are particularly weak at this point in time. Notwithstanding what we were just talking about, the British emerged from the Blitzkrieg period. The Royal Navy suffered some heavy losses, including the loss of 14 destroyers that are sunk during this 2-month period. And beyond this, large numbers of destroyers have been damaged and have to go in for repairs. So they emerged from this period with only 74 destroyers that are available for operational use. Now, of this 74 destroyers, a sizable portion of these have to be retained in Britain because they're anticipating a German invasion. So they're retaining this strength within Britain in order to be able to confront that invasion. And of course, at this time, the war in the Mediterranean has also begun now. And they have, obviously, some of their naval strength is diverted away into the Mediterranean. So this doesn't leave a whole lot that's available for the British to defend their maritime lines of communication. And I will give you a very good snapshot that kind of illustrates this point. And that is on the 1st of July, 1940, on that specific day, the total number of escorts that the British have at sea to support 16 different convoys that are crossing the Atlantic is 9. They have 9 escorts supporting 16 different convoys. And you kind of wonder, well, how does that work? Well, the way it worked is that the convoys spent most of their passage unescorted, at least unescorted when it came in the form of anti-submarine escorts. And it was only when they came into proximity of Britain that they would receive their anti-submarine defense. And then it was usually only in the form of one escort, because that's all the British had available at the time to be able to provide to them. So the British are particularly weak during this period. Now as the invasion threat wanes and as these destroyers are repaired, they're going to improve upon this somewhat. So by October, they're able to expand out their coverage a little farther into the Atlantic and increase the amount of coverage from 1 escort to 2. But this is still, woefully inadequate to what the needs are. And the Germans are able to take advantage of this. Again, the Germans still have only a relative handful of U-boats that they're able to operate, but this relative handful are able to operate into the Atlantic and basically sink Allied ships at will, because by and large, the Allied ships are undefended. And this is the period of the U-boat ace, where, again, you have these German U-boat skippers that are racking up these impressive scores, but they're racking up these scores primarily against undefended ships. And this will last, through February 1940. And during this time, the Germans will sink, they will lose 8 U-boats during this period of time, and they will sink 38 Allied merchant ships worth 210,000 tons for every U-boat that they lose. So again, it's the happy time because they're sinking large numbers of Allied ships for minimal losses to themselves. Why don't we move to the next slide, please? All right, the happy time ends in March 1941. As I mentioned earlier, during this 9-month period, the Germans will lose a total of 8 U-boats. Well, those 8 U-boats are all sunk during the first 6-month period. So for December, January, and February, there are no U-boat losses at all. But then you roll into March, and during a period of about 2.5 weeks, the Germans will lose 5 U-boats during this period, including 3 that are skippered by U-boat aces. Of those 5 U-boats that are sunk, 4 are sunk by British escort vessels, including the one that you see pictured here. And then the 5th U-boat just disappears due to unknown causes. And what this signals is not that the U-boat threat has been abated to any degree, but now the German U-boats cannot expect to operate in an environment of impunity, that the British now are starting to catch up with their defenses, and that the Germans are going to increasingly find themselves confronted by the British defenses for the remainder of this campaign. Still, this is not a good time for the British. In the first half of 1941, altogether, the Allies lose a total of 2.9 million tons of shipping. Now, this is globally, so this includes some losses in the Mediterranean, which are particularly heavy during the April-May timeframe when the Germans attack the Balkans and large numbers of Greek and Yugoslav ships are sunk. But most of this number, this 2.9 million ton number, again, focuses on the North Atlantic. British defense planners at this time are looking at the losses they've sustained, but more importantly, they're looking at the trends that are going on. And they're projecting that if the trends continue on at their current trajectory, that by the end of this year, by the end of 1941, they're projecting a loss of 7 million tons of Allied shipping, and they're contemplating the impacts this is going to have on Britain's import situation. And it doesn't look good. Now, again, we're not necessarily talking crisis, but obviously we're not talking about a good situation. Fortunately for the British, things are already underway that are going to turn the tide against this trend that has been going on. We can go to the next slide, please. All right. So first of all, I'll talk about what's going on in terms of turning the tide against the other things other than the U-boats that have been attacking the British lines of communication. Because as I talked about the happy time, that was mostly the U-boats, but the Germans are also using their aircraft, they're using mines, they're using surface craft to also inflict a fair degree of damage against the British during this period of time. But during the second half of the year, this will be largely abated. As far as the Luftwaffe is concerned, the primary factor here is that in June 1941, the Germans attacked the Soviet Union. And so the bulk of the Luftwaffe forces deploy to the east to face the Soviets. Since the aircraft are also responsible for much of the mine lane operations, this has an impact upon that. So in the second half of 1941, Allied shipping losses to the Luftwaffe will decline by 82%, while Allied shipping losses to mine lane will decline by 55%. Now, as far as the surface warships are concerned, the Germans use different types of surface warships to attack Allied maritime traffic. They use some of their larger ships, such as their capital ships, and some of the cruisers during the early part of the war will go out and sortie against the convoy routes. But this is basically stopped after the destruction of the German battleship Bismarck, which occurs in May 1941. The Germans had dispatched Bismarck and Prince Eugen to go out and attack British convoys. Instead, the British are able to hunt down and sink the Bismarck. Of course, this is only after Bismarck itself has sunk the battle cruiser Hood. But eventually, the British are able to hunt down and sink Bismarck with the home fleet, including the battleship Rodney, which we have pictured here. And this really ends German use of major warships moving into the Atlantic. Because Hitler, who never has much confidence in the major warships of the German Kriegsmarine, and he believes that losses of these major ships is an affront to German prestige and morale. So when Bismarck is sunk, and a couple years before that, when Graf Spee was sunk in the South Atlantic, he sees these as an affront to German prestige. And after the loss of Bismarck, he basically restricts the German using their major warships for this operation. And then, a few months later, he becomes obsessed with this idea that the Allies are going to attack Norway, and he diverts much of what remains of the German surface fleet up to Norway as more of a defensive measure. And so, for all intents and purposes, the threat of the German surface warships, at least the major surface warships, abates after the destruction of Bismarck. Now, even if that hadn't been the case, another one of these things that's not necessarily well known, but in 2 months after the destruction of Bismarck, the British are able to systematically hunt down and destroy much of the logistical network that the Germans had established in the Atlantic in order to support these surface raider operations. During a period of about 2 months, they sank 13 German merchant ships that had been pre-positioned out into the Atlantic, including 6 tankers that are sunk during this time frame. So even if the Germans hadn't shut this down on their own, the damage that was done to the logistical network may have seriously impeded it anyway. Now, there's one other component of this surface raider aspect, and that was armed merchant cruisers. The Germans also use a number of armed merchant cruisers, which are basically armed merchant ships that they've deployed out in the world's oceans to hunt Allied shipping. And they will enjoy some success during the first part of the war, but in the latter half of 1941, 3 of these merchant cruisers will be sunk, 2 by British cruisers, 1 by an Australian cruiser. And this, plus the improved British defenses, largely negates the effectiveness of the armed merchant cruisers thereafter. The results of all of this is during the second half of 1941, Allied losses due to surface ships decreased by 76%. And thereafter, going into 1942 and beyond, it basically is a non-factor in the battle.
And that's huge. 76%, that's a huge, huge drop. And I think some of this data you're going to be throwing our way is really important. And just by the way, viewers, Ian Ballantyne is joining us on Friday to talk about the Bismarck. So he's written 3 books on the Bismarck. So there is no one better to talk about that story than Ian Ballantyne. So that's Friday's show at the end of the week.
All right. So we move to the next slide, please. All right. So I've talked about these other things. Now let's talk about the U-boats, because again, going into the war, they're still the predominant threat. They're going to emerge from this period as basically, the only threat that the Germans really are going to have left, that they're going to be throwing at the British during the course of this campaign. So what of the U-boats? Well, fortunately for the British, they're able also to turn the tides against the U-boats during this period of time. And again, there are a number of factors that contribute to this. I'm only going to count upon 2, which in my mind are the most important. The first of these is simply the fact that the British are better in their defensive position now. A lot of this stems from the fact that they just simply have more escorts that are available. Many of these escorts that were under construction, in 1939, are now coming into service in the latter part, or the middle of 1941. This is also, part of this is a benefit of the destroyers from bases deal that the British conclude with the United States, and they're able to bring some of those vessels into service. Part of this is due to the fact that Canada is becoming a much more important partner in this enterprise, and you have output from Canadian shipyards, and Canada is assuming a major role in this operation as well. The bottom line is you simply have many more escorts available. And again, I'm going to give you another snapshot that helps illustrate this. Again, before, as I was telling you, in the 1st of July 1940, the British only had 9 escorts at sea on that specific day. You advance 1 year later to the 1st of July 1941, and the total number of escorts at sea supporting Atlantic convoys on that day is 65. So it's a 7-fold increase. And by the 1st of October, that'll be increased to 94. So they simply have many more escort vessels that are available. The second issue, which kind of goes hand in hand with this in terms of the improved British defensive situation, is they've got access to additional bases now. And particularly what I'm referring to is, the British have occupied Iceland in 1940. By the middle of 1941, they've turned Iceland into a base, and they're able to operate from there. And they're also operating from St. John's, Newfoundland. And combination of these different factors, the British are finally able now to provide continuous coverage for their convoys crossing the Atlantic. The first of these convoys will occur at the end of May 1941, and over the next few months, it'll be expanded to the point that by the time you exit the summer, pretty much all convoys that are traveling across the Atlantic now are in fully defended convoys through the course of their passage. And obviously, that's huge. Now, the second factor that's going to contribute to this reversal against the U-boats is ultra. During this time, the Germans have their Enigma machines. They have a variety of different codes that they communicate with their armed forces with. One of these codes is called the home waters key, which is the primary key that they use to communicate with their Atlantic-based and Mediterranean-based U-boats. And in the summer of 1941, the British are able to break this home waters key. Again, there are some factors that go into this, but one of the major factors that allow this is a number of seizures that the British are able to do of classified German code books and materials from various German warships during 1941, including, and most importantly of these, is the capture of U-110 in May 1941 by HMS Bulldog, which is pictured here, in which the British recovered not only classified materials and code books, but they recovered an entire Enigma machine. And with the help of these various classified materials that they are able to acquire, the British are able to break the home waters key. And this has a major impact because the British now are reading the correspondence going back, the radio messages going back and forth between the U-boats and their high command. And as a result of this, they're able to have a very good understanding of the location of the various U-boats and their disposition. And among other things, this allows the British to route their convoys around the U-boat concentrations. And there will be periods of time for days and even weeks where the Germans are basically searching empty ocean, unable to find anything to attack. And the reason for that is because the British know where the U-boats are located, and they're essentially routing the convoys around their locations. So the bottom line to all of this is sinkings by U-boats in the second half of 1941 declined by 55%. And overall, when you look at the total 6-month period from July through December 1941, the Allies will lose a total of 1.4 million tons of shipping. Again, this includes the Mediterranean, and this also includes now in December the Pacific conflict, which erupts there. But overall, about 1.4 million tons of shipping that is sunk. When you add this to the losses of the first part of the year, total losses for the year amount to 4.3 million tons of shipping, which is still a sizable number, but it is far less than the 7 million tons that British defense planners had projected, might be lost had they not been able to turn this tide against the U-boats. So the British have dodged a major bullet here. And then the final thing, of course, that happens at the end of this period is the United States comes into the war. And I can't emphasize just how important that is, or I can't underestimate how important that is, because it basically dooms any prospects the Germans have of winning their tonnage strategy. For two reasons. Number one, when the United States comes into the war, it brings in with it its own merchant fleet, which is 10 million tons strong, which more than makes up for the losses the Allies have suffered up to this point in the war. Now, in fairness, much of this American merchant fleet is going to be used by the Americans themselves, and it's going to be oriented towards the Pacific. But a fair amount of this is also going to be directly involved into the Battle of the Atlantic. The second thing, and it's probably even more important than this, is America's immense shipbuilding capacity, which will take about a year and a half to fully get mobilized. But once it does, America will be in a position where they'll be producing more than 1 million tons of shipping per month. And the Americans are just going to be building ships faster than the Germans could ever hope to sink them. So in my mind, and in retrospect, you realize that once you get through this period, the Germans never really have a chance to win this battle, or at least to be successful in their tonnage strategy. They're waging a battle that they cannot win. And that becomes evident as time goes on.
And just to jump in again, Brian, I think we started off by talking about this being a long campaign, which of course it was. But the other advantage of a long campaign is you've got data. You can make predictions. And it's like in science, isn't it? The true ability of science is you've got enough data from the past, you can start making predictions about the future. And with Canada, the USA, and Britain, and the incredible role of naval intelligence generally, beyond Ultra, but just intelligence generally, we can start now making predictions of if we can expect to lose this. So if we have this, we can compensate for that, and you can start to roll out the data. But of course, when you're looking at how a battle is perceived by the public, analyzing data isn't very sexy, is it? What's much more sexy is going out in short Sunderlands and dropping torpedoes on U-boats. But in fact, this ability to predict and make calculations was vital, was it not?
It was. I mean, very much so. The Battle of the Atlantic is a battle of statistics. And again, I tend to agree with it. That doesn't tend necessarily to be the sexiest of topics, but it's absolutely critical to the entire Allied war effort. Like I said, you cannot really understand what's going on without understanding that it all stems from this. I think, like I said, some people don't necessarily like getting, they don't necessarily like getting bogged down in statistics, but the statistics are really what drive the Allies to be able to be successful here. Okay, Can we go to the next slide, please?
Yep.
Okay, so I just said, and again, just to reiterate, in my mind, then, the fact that the Allies, the British, are able to reverse this situation in 1941, in my mind, is the true turning point of the Battle of the Atlantic. And as I said before, going beyond this point, it really dooms any prospects the Germans have of winning this battle. And that will be fleshed out a little bit later on. But in the immediate period after this, that seems to be kind of a contrary thing, because the Germans are going to have an immediate recovery from this period during 1942. And 1942 is going to be a tough year for them. The vehicle allows the Germans to have this recovery as they're able to operate off of America's eastern seaboard. And they launch what they call Operation Drumbeat. Now, America's entry into the war is cataclysmic for the Germans, but at least on one short-term factor, it allows the Germans to attack shipping that had been unavailable for them to attack thus far into the war. And that's the plethora of targets that are traveling up and down America's eastern seaboard. And this had been kind of off limits to them. But now that America's into the war, they can go and attack these things. The problem for the Germans is, again, at this time in December 1941, that the U-boat fleet has expanded to about 99 boats now. Again, they suffered some losses during the way, but overall they've got about 99 boats now. But most of these are the Type 7s, and the Type 7s just don't have the range to be able to effectively operate off the eastern seaboard. The Type 9s do, but they only have a relative handful of these. So in December 1941, the Germans are only able to dispatch a total of 5 Type 9s to the Americas. It's going to take about a month for them to cross the Atlantic, but once they get off the Americans' eastern seaboard, they find conditions to be ideal. You have a plethora of targets traveling up and down the eastern seaboard. They're not traveling in convoys. They're still following normal shipping routes. They're burning their navigation lights. The coastline isn't blacked out. And the Americans have got a pitiful defensive arrangement that's in place to try and defend 1,500 miles of coastline with a grand total of 20 escort vessels. So the Germans find ideal conditions, and they immediately take advantage of this. The 5 U-boats that are initially dispatched sink 150,000 tons of shipping and immediately report back to Germany about how good the conditions are. Well, Dornitz has already got additional waves that he's already dispatched. And as each successive wave arrives off of the Americas, they're going to find continued ideal conditions, and they're just going to continue this. From January through March, the Germans will dispatch a total of 70 U-boats to the Americas. Together, they'll sink about 1.15 million tons of shipping for virtually no loss to themselves. And this will be dubbed the second happy time by the Germans because they're in a position now where they're sinking large numbers of ships for virtually no loss to themselves. Now, as you can imagine, the British are horrified by what they see because they've been warning the Americans of what's coming. And it's galling to see here we're able to escort convoys across the Atlantic unscathed, only to see ships destroyed on America's doorstep. So in March 1942, the British actually sent aid to their American allies in the form of, among other things, 10 corvettes and 24 anti-submarine trawlers, which the British provide to the Americans. And I like to point this out because, of course, during World War II, we're used to the idea of America providing material aid, to the various allied nations, to Britain, to Australia, to Russia, etc. But here's an example where the British are providing aid to the Americans. So we move into the April-May timeframe. The Germans are continuing to exploit this weakness that exists off Americans' eastern seaboard. They dispatch another 48 U-boats during this period. They sink 1 million tons of shipping. But by April, the Americans cannot ignore the catastrophe that's occurring on their eastern seaboard, and they start to take effective countermeasures. Most important of these is they implement a rudimentary convoy system, which is really very rudimentary. It's literally just collections of merchant ships kind of on their own, collecting together and making hops along the eastern seaboard, taking shelter at night. And as soon as they begin to do this, they find it's immediately effective at countering the U-boats. And very quickly, the Americans begin to formalize and expand this, very much negating the effectiveness of the German operations. The Germans respond to this by just simply shifting their operations farther south where the convoys haven't been deployed yet. And the thing that allows them to do this is by this time, the Germans are now deploying what they call U-tankers or milk cow U-boats, which are replenishment U-boats that use at-sea refueling. And with this at-sea refueling, they're able to extend the ranges of the Type 7s now to be able to effectively operate off the American eastern seaboard. And the Type 9s can operate well into the Gulf of Mexico, all the way to the coast of Texas and around South America. So as the Americans are expanding and formalizing their convoys, the Germans are just pushing into areas where the convoys haven't been instituted yet. And this will go on for a few months until eventually you're going to reach August of 1942, where Dornitz is going to realize that he's gotten about as much benefit out of Operation Drumbeat as he's going to get. And during that month, he still sends in a number of U-boats to operate off the Americas, but the bulk of his force then is redirected back towards the North Atlantic convoy routes. And then thereafter, the whole focus will be back on the North Atlantic convoy routes. So for a period of about 9 months, the Germans will dispatch a total of 184 U-boats to operate off the Americas. They in turn will sink 3.1 million tons of shipping. And they will lose 15 of their own number in return, with 7 more that are lost en route. Most of these losses occurred in the latter part of this period, again, attesting to the improved Allied defenses that have eventually forced the Germans to abandon Operation Drumbeat. But while it's going on, it's highly effective for the Germans. So now the focus of the battle returns to the North Atlantic convoy routes. Can we go to the next slide, please? All right, and this is very much now a brute force operation against brute force. This is no longer a handful of U-boats operating against a handful of escorts or generally unescorted convoys. Instead, you have Dornitz has finally got his force of 300 U-boats by this time, and the Allies have literally hundreds of escorts that are available to them and hundreds of aircraft that are also involved in this campaign. So it's brute force against brute force. And the primary focus now will be in the North Atlantic, although there will be a bit of a diversion in November 1942 when the Allies invade North Africa, and the Germans will shift some of their operations in order to impede this. November will be a very bad month for the Allies. They will lose more shipping losses in November than in any other month in the war. And when you look at the year as a whole, 1942, again, all theaters of operation, including the Mediterranean and the Pacific, the Allies will lose 7.8 million tons of shipping during 1942, which is substantially higher than the losses that they suffered in 1941. And again, it does sound like, well, maybe it does sound like the Germans are making some progress here. But again, when you step back a little farther and look at the broader picture, you realize that they're not really making the type of progress that they need. Among other things, because during the same year, America produces 5.4 million tons of new merchant shipping, and another 1.3 million tons is added by British shipping yards. So the result is the Allies produce 6.7 million tons against a loss of 7.8 million tons. The net loss is 1.1 million tons of shipping. And this is against an overall shipping pool that's over 30 million tons strong now, with America's entry into the war. So while it looks like the Germans might be making some progress, and maybe they're making little progress, they're not making anywhere near the progress they need to do. And this will become very evident once you move into 1943. Again, by the time you hit the second quarter of 1943, that's when America's shipbuilding capacity is fully operating now, and the Americans will start producing 1 million tons of shipping every month. And you get to the point now, by the time you roll into May, that in order just to keep up with Allied new construction, the Germans have to sink 1.3 million tons of ships per month just to keep up. So we're not talking about the 700,000 ton threshold that the Germans had originally established, but you're talking about 1.3 million tons of shipping just to keep up with Allied production. And obviously, you're going to have to sink a lot more than that if you want to attrit the Allied merchant fleet at all. And the Germans aren't sinking anywhere close to this. As you can see, November was a good month for them, but beyond that, most months, they're not even sinking half this number. And in many cases, they're only sinking about a quarter of the amount of shipping that they need to sink. So again, I reiterate, this is a battle that the Germans cannot win. And that fact will be driven home then in May 1943, when the Allies will absolutely demonstrate their ascendancy over the U-boats. Total Allied shipping losses will decrease to only 237,000 tons, which is the least amount of tonnage that they've lost probably since November of 1941. And total German U-boat losses during this month jump up to 40, which is more than twice as high as the next highest month that occurred prior to this, which is in February 1941 when they lose 19. So
we should make the point that it's the crews as well. As someone said that very early on, it's not just the boats themselves; it's the experienced crews, these veteran ace crews that they can't replace. The same applies to Luftwaffe and their tank units in the Eastern Front. It's not just about the equipment; it's about the experience of the people that are equipping them as well.
You read my mind, because we're going to go into that now. So if you want to advance to the next slide, please. So the Allies are able to attain this ascendancy over the U-boats in May 1943. What are some of the factors that allowed them to do that? And we're going to discuss some of those factors here. One of those is, as you indicated, it's the proficiency of the crews involved. Because by this time in the war, now the Allies have been engaged in this contest for at least 3 years now, and they've become pretty good. They've become, by and large, the Allied crews are well led, they're well trained, they're well motivated, and they're going to be performing fairly well, both when you're dealing with the escort crews and the units that are involved in that, but also in the air as well. The various aerial components are contributing in this. By comparison, the Germans aren't in as good of a situation because, as you alluded to, when you lose a U-boat, you also usually lose the crew with this. And in 1942, the Germans will lose a total of 86 U-boats, and then in the first 4 months of 1943, they lose another 56. And most of the time, the crews went along with these things. So by the time you're rolling into the May battle, you don't have experienced U-boat captains anymore, and you don't have experienced crews. And the gauntlet of Allied defenses that these inexperienced U-boat captains are facing is much more severe than anything their predecessors during the happy times had faced. So during this time, Jornitz is going to be constantly trying to dog his U-boat commanders to be more aggressive, and he laments the fact that their timidity. Well, they're facing much greater adversity, and again, they don't have that same level of experience because the experienced guys are by and large gone. So the Allies have a qualitative edge when it comes to their crews and the morale associated around this. Now, that's not to say the Germans aren't displaying great bravery, because they are, but they just don't have the same level of proficiency by and large as Allies demonstrate. The Germans are also losing the technology battle here. By the time you roll into 1943, the Germans are largely waging this battle with the same equipment that they had started the war out with. Obviously, there have been some technological improvements, but not that much. By comparison, the Allies have all kinds of technical innovations that they're able to bring into this battle. The most important of these is radar, in my mind. Now, obviously, the Allies have radar. Well, both sides have radar at the beginning of the war, but it's these large ground-mounted, with the large antennas and everything. But very early on, the Allies are able to put radar into not just their big warships, but also their escorts and onto aircraft. And this is huge because it robs the U-boats of one of their greatest weapons, which is the ability to operate stealthily at night and under conditions of low visibility. So no longer do the Allies have to depend upon eyesight in order to locate the U-boats, because they have this electronic aid to be able to do this. And of course, as the war goes on, they're constantly improving these radar sets. So this is, in my mind, the most important technical innovation that impacts this battle. Another major acquisition technology that they develop is high-frequency direction finders, which, again, exists before the war begins, but the Allies are able to start mounting these on ships. And when German U-boats transmit their radios, local Allied escort commanders are able to hone in on that, and it warns them that there are U-boats in the area and gives them a general proximity and bearing on where those U-boats are located. So that's an important acquisition weapon. They also have a variety of actual, ordnance that they can deliver, improved depth charges that can go deeper, have a more powerful punch. They have the Hedgehog forward-firing mortar system, which will ultimately, by the end of the war, be replaced by the Squid forward-firing mortar system. They have a variety of airborne weapons that they utilize, airborne depth charges, aerial rockets, and a weapon called Fido, which becomes operational during this period of time, which is an airdrop acoustic homing torpedo, which really gives the aircraft the ability to sink submerged U-boats. They drop these things in the swirl of a U-boat that has dived, and it'll hone in on the screw noises of the U-boat itself. So we're not talking dumb depth charges anymore. This is a self-guiding weapon, and it has the potential to be devastating to the Germans. So they have a variety of different technology that the Germans just simply have not been able to keep up with. And this is a major factor. Also, there are organizational improvements. Very early on in the war, the British stopped using just random collections of warships to defend their convoys, and they've established formal escort groups, which are units that operate together. They train together, and these escort groups are what they use to then escort the convoys. Much more effective than just random groups of ships that just happen to come together. Then in 1943, they also introduced what they call support groups, which a support group is kind of akin to a fire brigade. They're not part of a convoy's inherent defense, but rather are used where they're needed to reinforce threatened convoys. And because a support group is not a part of a convoy's inherent defense, sometimes it has the ability to linger in an area and hunt a U-boat to its ultimate demise, as opposed to simply suppressing them, which is often the case with the convoy escorts, because they have to remain with the convoys. And the Allies will begin deploying these support groups in the latter half of basically about the May timeframe is when the support groups are starting to come into operation. And the support groups, many of these are built around escort carriers. So we talked about those a little bit earlier. Those are starting to come into play as well. And then the final thing that influences, again, is we're going back to Ultra. I talked before about in 1941, the British are able to break the home waters key. And for about 8 months, they're able to read this U-boat traffic without any problem. In February 1942, the Germans develop a new key to communicate with their U-boats. It's called Triton. And they add a fourth rotor onto their Enigma machines. And this immediately blacks out Britain's ability to read this U-boat traffic. Almost at about the same time, the Germans break the primary code that the British used to communicate with the convoys, which was Naval Cipher number 3. So this crypto intelligence pendulum, which has kind of been swinging back and forth, now swings in favor of the Germans. And for a number of months, the British are unaware of the fact that their own codes have been breached, and they're not able to read the German codes. And they finally get a break at the end of October 1942 with the destruction of U-559, which is sunk in the Mediterranean. And before the U-boat is sunk, a landing party from HMS Petard is able to get onto the U-boat and pass up some classified documents in the code books out of this. And with the benefit of those code books, Bletchley Park is finally able to make progress against the Triton code. It'll still take a number of months before Triton is fully mastered. But by the time you roll into May 1943, the British have pretty much mastered Triton. And by doing this, they're able to learn that their own codes have been compromised. So they replace Naval Cipher number 3 with Naval Cipher number 5. And so, again, that pendulum now swings back in favor of the British, and it'll never swing the other way again. The British will be able to read the Triton codes for the remainder of the war. The Germans will be blacked out as far as the Allied codes are concerned. So all of these things come together, and it really establishes Britain's and the Allies' ascendancy over the U-boats. As I said before, the U-boats will lose 40 the Germans will lose 40 U-boats during the course of May 1943. Even Dornitz recognizes that this is unsustainable, that his forces cannot suffer this type of losses, and he withdraws the U-boats. At the end of the month, he withdraws the U-boats from the Atlantic. Let's move to the next slide, please. So he removes the U-boats. Well, what exactly does that mean? Do they all come back into port? No. What he does is his plan is that this is always going to be a temporary withdrawal. He wants to abandon the North Atlantic for a period of time until he can rearm with new weapons, and then he's going to proceed back into the North Atlantic. In the meantime, he's going to continue to operate, but he's just shifted his operations into the Central Atlantic and off the Americas, where he hopes that the American defenses are less strong. So he's trying to preserve his strength while at the same time, and eventually he's going to return to the North Atlantic convoy routes. Unfortunately for him, it doesn't work out that well. Because he finds that the Allies are pretty much strong everywhere by this stage in the war. And not only that, but the Allies are increasingly going over onto the offensive. And this offensive basically exists in two major forms. First of all, you have the Bay of Biscay offensive, which, the Allies, the British have been operating in the Bay of Biscay, for a long time now. The Bay of Biscay, of course, is the passageway in which U-boats that are transiting into and out of the Atlantic from the Atlantic ports, they have to pass through this area. And in the summer of 1943, the British are going to saturate this area with Coastal Command aircraft, and they're also going to use some of these support groups that I talked about on the fringes to try and support this operation, attacking the German U-boats that have to cross this transit point. In addition to this, as I said, much of this effort has switched into the Central Atlantic, which is an American area of operations. And the Americans are not content to just defensively defend their convoys, but they go on to the offensive, again, using support groups that they refer to as hunter-killer groups built around escort carriers like the one you see here, to actively go out and hunt the German U-boats. And they're aided in this effect by Ultra intelligence and by high frequency direction finding, and they're able to aggressively hunt these U-boats. And particularly targeted are the U-tankers. So the result of this is, whereas Donitz hoped that he would find, better conditions for his U-boats during this period, he really doesn't. And in June of 1940, the Allies, or the Germans, are only able to sink about 76,000 tons of Allied shipping, which is a pittance compared to now what's being produced and the size of the Allied merchant fleet. They lose 17 U-boats in comparison. In July, the rates go back up to the level that had been the case in May. The Allies lose 237,000 tons of shipping, but the Germans lose 37 U-boats. So it's almost a repeat of May. And then in August, the Allied losses go back down to below 100,000, and the Germans lose 25 U-boats. So this period, he hasn't really worked out for Donitz. But by the time he moves into September now, he's finally able to, again, he's got his new weapons, and he's going to redeploy back into the North Atlantic. And he does this with his first group of U-boats. It's called, I believe it's called Group Luchen, consisting of 21 Type 7s that move into the North Atlantic. And these are armed with his new weapons. Primarily what we're talking about is T5 acoustic homing torpedoes. The U-boats have increased anti-aircraft defenses, and they have a new radar detector, which they hope will detect the Allied airborne radars, give them adequate warning so they can avoid the Allied aircraft. And he's able to launch this operation into the North Atlantic. This group engages two convoys that kind of converge into one convoy. You have ONS-18 and ON-202. And during the course of the convoy battle that follows, the Germans do gain, some better results than had been the case over the last several months. They're able to sink 6 merchant ships and 3 of the escort vessels for the loss of 3 of their own U-boats. Of course, the German U-boat commanders inflate what they actually, they report more sinkings than what they actually did. And the Germans kind of feel that they've won this great victory. And it is, to a degree, it's more successful than some of the more recent operations have been. But it still represents an unsupportable exchange rate for the Germans. And unfortunately for them, it's even at this, it's a level of attrition that they cannot continue to repeat. Partly because of the German weapons that are deployed, the T5 proves to be the most effective. Again, it is effective at sinking Allied escort vessels, but the Allies have long anticipated the deployment of such weapons, and they immediately counter this with Foxer and Cat acoustic decoys, which will greatly negate the effectiveness of the T5 for the remainder of the war. It won't entirely eliminate it, but it will greatly negate it. The additional anti-aircraft defenses he's put on his U-boats, yes, this enhances his U-boats, but the U-boats are still very susceptible to Allied air attack, as will be indicated during the preceding period of time. And then finally, the radar detector proves to be a complete failure because it's searching in the wrong wavelength. By this time, the most advanced Allied radars are searching in a 10-centimeter wavelength, or are operating in a 10-centimeter wavelength. And this radar detector is searching in an 80-centimeter wavelength. And so it cannot detect the latest versions of the Allied radar. And this is, again, another example where German technology has failed to keep up with the Allied technology. The results of all of this is the Germans aren't able to sustain the limited degree of success they have with this initial convoy battle. And through September and October, again, they're not able to sink much more than 90,000 tons of shipping either month. Their own losses amount to 10 U-boats in September, which, realistically, is the lowest number of U-boats that they've suffered since January. But then in October, their losses go right back up to 26. And this is not sustainable for them. And so at the end of this period, the Germans pretty much acknowledged that, yes, we failed in our tonnage strategy, and they move over onto the defensive. If you'd like, we can go to the next slide. So this is the final turning point of the war. For the first 2/3 of the war, the Germans are really using their U-boats as an offensive weapon. They're trying to drive Britain out of the war. They recognize by this point that they simply are not capable of winning this tonnage strategy, and they move the emphasis of the U-boat operations to defensive applications, where they see the U-boats as their first line of defense in the West. They know that an Allied invasion of Western Europe is on the horizon, and they want to preserve their U-boat strength to help deter that. Now that doesn't mean they're going to abandon the Atlantic altogether, but to a very large extent, they abandoned wolf pack tactics. They're just going to send out handfuls of U-boats in the Atlantic to keep the Allied defenses spread out, maybe attrit whatever they can to try and maybe impede a little bit the Allied buildup that's going on in Britain, but they're not trying to drive Britain out of the war here. And then and before I go on that, and of course they're trying to preserve their U-boat strength, which doesn't really work out that well for them, because again, during the first 5 months of 1944, they still lose 105 U-boats, even though they're not, fully engaged to the extent they had been earlier. And then once the Normandy invasion is launched, the Germans will use their U-boats to try and impede this, and it's not good for them. During the first month of the Normandy battle in June, they will lose a total of 22 U-boats in Northwest European waters. By comparison, they'll only be able to sink a total of 6 Allied ships that are associated with the Normandy invasion. That's three Liberty ships, an LST, and 2 British escorts. And then if you stretch out the Normandy campaign altogether, throughout the duration through the end of August 1944, the Allies will be able to successfully land over 2 million men, about 440,000 vehicles, and over almost 3.1 million tons of supplies.
Yep.
And during roughly the same period, the 24th of June through the 12th of September, the Germans are only able to sink 8,200 tons of stores that are en route to France. So we're talking about, at best, 1/4% of the resources that are flowing into France are interdicted by the Germans. And in turn, the Germans are going to lose 64 U-boats during this 3-month period, including 48 that are sunk directly relating to the Normandy campaign. So the Allies win the Battle of Normandy. They branch out from there. They're liberating, Western Europe and advancing into Germany. And the Germans are still deploying their U-boats, again, to try and do whatever they can to impede Allied logistical operations. By and large, they're not very successful. Dornitz has a statement, I'm going to paraphrase it, where basically he says every merchant ship that we can sink that's laden with materials before it arrives to France eases the burden for our ground forces. And I suppose there's truth in that, but the scale of operations that the Allies are executing here, the Germans at best are able to inflict pinpricks. In fact, in the last year and a half of the war, at no time will the Germans be able to sink more than 100,000 tons of Allied shipping, and the average will be 56,000 tons. These are pinpricks. And in the last full month of the Northwest Europe campaign, the Allies will deliver almost 3.5 million tons of supplies to support operations in Northwest Europe. And the amount of this that the Germans are interdict is incontestable. So, wow. It's a failure there. Now, the final thing I'll just point out is that while they're engaging in this thing, Dornitz had always hoped and always planned to eventually return to the convoy battles. And again, the weapon he hoped to use was the Type 21 U-boat, which was a revolutionary new design that he hoped to bring into this battle. Fortunately for the Allies, the Type 21s arrived too late to have any difference. By the time the first Type 21s are operational, the war is over. And again, a good part of what delays the production of these Type 21s is the intensive Allied bombing campaign. So as a result of all of these different activities, again, eventually he'd hoped to do this, but he's never able to return to the North Atlantic convoy routes. So once they go over to the defensive, they remain on the defensive for the remainder of the war. Next slide. So now I'm going to give a campaign overview. Again, a fair amount of data that's here. Just snapshots, basically annual data, to try and emphasize some different characteristics of this battle. Now, the first 2 columns talk about Allied shipping losses. And as you can see, clearly the Allies lost a lot of ships during the course of the war. Now, again, not all of this. This is total Allied losses. So not all of this is related to the Battle of the Atlantic. This includes losses that have also occurred in the Pacific, in the Mediterranean, and the Arctic, etc. But most of this is a result of the Battle of the Atlantic. And the Allies lose a lot of ships, but they don't lose enough to ever really make a difference. And I think that's quintessential. And not only do they not lose enough to make a difference, but then when you actually look at the data, you realize that this was never really a close run thing. And there's 2 sets of information that I'm going to point this out with. The first of these is the 3rd column, which is the size of the number of ships or the number of merchant tonnage that were available to the British at various times in the battle on an annual basis. And again, you have to remember that originally this was the whole target of Donitz's tonnage campaign, was to impede and attrit the British and the Allied merchant fleets, and attrit them down to the point where they could no longer support Britain's import needs. And while it's true that the Germans are able to sink a lot of ships, by and large, the British are able to replace those losses. And in fact, the Germans never really attained any real degree of attrition against the British merchant fleet. And in fact, the British merchant fleet expands during the course of the war. And this is just the British merchant fleet. Of course, once the United States gets involved, that's added into this equation. By the time the war ends, it's the United States that has the world's dominant merchant fleet. So the Germans have utterly failed in this goal of attriting the Allied merchant fleet. And in fact, they make no real progress in real terms, in absolute terms, in this goal. And then if we look at the fourth column, that's imports into the United Kingdom. Of course, that's ultimately what this battle was all about. And if we look at 1942, which was the worst year of the war for the Allies during this campaign, the Allies still managed to bring in 34 million tons of imports into the United Kingdom. Now, in fairness, this is only about half of the imports that they had been bringing in pre-war, but this is still substantially higher than the 27 million ton threshold that they had established for themselves. And this is during the worst year of the war. On every other year of the war, the British are able to bring in over 40 million tons, and in one case, over 50 million tons. And this is more than enough tonnage to support the British nation and the British economy, and allow British industry and British society to conduct a robust war effort. So again, you never, even in 1942, you never really approach crisis levels because the British are able to bring in, several million tons more than the minimum level that they'd established for themselves.
But just to be devil's advocate for a second there, and David O'Keefe is making the point that what do you say there? You're not specifically talking about tanker losses, for example, in 1942, but when we're looking at those graphs now with 43, 44, and 45 there, we can see that 1942 was an anomaly in a sense against the whole thing. But at the time, without the benefit of knowing things were going to go better, is it fair to say that it was close to crisis point, or is crisis too strong a word?
I think it's too strong of a word. From what I understand, the authorities at the time never felt that they were in a crisis. Now, again, and we've talked about this. I mean, there are plenty of books that make it sound like this. There are documentaries and things that make it sound like Britain was on the edge. But from my understanding, of the authorities at the time that were waging this battle never really saw that they were in a crisis situation. And again, at the same time, too, of course, with the hindsight of history, we're able to look at these things, just as I've been stating here, that, with the hindsight of history, we can now see that the Germans after 1941 were never really in a position to win it. That wasn't necessarily known at the time, though. At the time, the Americans are talking about, and they make an announcement of what they're planning to build in terms of shipping. The Germans think this is just bluster. They can't imagine that the Americans actually produce shipping at the level that they're stating that they can. But they can. So I agree with you, when you're in the trenches itself, things are not nearly as apparent as they are with the hindsight of history. But I don't believe that there was anything that the authorities at the time ever felt that they were in a crisis situation.
Cool. I mean, this is the interesting thing, that it's all about the use of language now as well, isn't it? And was it perceived as a crisis? And again, even at the time, there'd have been debates. Some people might have used the word crisis. Some might have pointed, we've got a problem. It's not that everybody involved in the Royal Navy and the Merchant Navy was of one voice back in 1942. So, and the politicians are saying one thing, and there's Churchill. So, but your considered opinion is that it wasn't really a crisis. It was dramatic and it was important, but that's your opinion. So that's.
Well, I think everyone would acknowledge it was important and it was critical what they were dealing with. But I think crisis. Let's put it this way. I don't think people were panicking. But again, some people may have been. But I think the prevailing feeling at the time, because again, they kind of knew what was on the I just think they had it. Like I said, even in like the March 1943 timeframe, when there's a couple convoy battles that are fought that go fairly tough for the Allies, most of the convoys still cross the Atlantic, in fairly good shape. And people can see the big picture even at the time. At least to a degree, they can see the big picture. Obviously, we can see it better now, but I think they could see it back then. So, with me all saying this now, that this was not a near-run thing, does that mean that maybe the threat was overblown? And I would respond to that as saying, no, I think the threat was very real. And I think the fact that that the Germans weren't successful in this, and that it was never as close a run thing as some in the popular culture seem to make it out to be, is more of a reflection of the effectiveness of the British and the Allied response to the threat, as opposed to the notion that the threat wasn't real. And to bolster this argument, I just turn to what happened in the Pacific, where the Americans, with some Commonwealth contribution, but overwhelmingly the Americans, are able to do exactly to the Japanese what the Germans are attempting to do to the British. In a period of little more than 3 years, the Americans decimate the Japanese merchant fleet to the extent that 85% of the accumulated Japanese merchant fleet is lost. Of what remains, 2/3 of that is laid up. So the Japanese are left at the end of the war with only 5.5% of their accumulated merchant fleet operational. Japanese overseas trade absolutely collapses, and the home islands are left completely cut off from the empire. Now, the fact that the Americans are able to do this, yes, in one hand, is a reflection of American prowess, but I think is more of a reflection of the ineptitude that the Japanese showed at defending their own lines of communication. By comparison, in the Atlantic, arguably, the Germans make a greater effort to impede British lines of communication. As I said, eventually they're going to produce 1,200 U-boats, or almost 1,200 U-boats. And the fact that they're not able to be more successful, again, is not that the threat isn't real. It's the fact that the Allies are just not going to let them win this battle, and the effectiveness of the Allied response to that. And of course, at the end of the day, the Germans will pay a high cost for their failure, because in the final column, you can see the U-boat losses. These are losses that are accumulated through combat action, through accidents, through unknown causes, and U-boats that are scuttled. And a total of 1,015 are lost through these various activities during the course of the war. Another 163 will surrender to the Allies at the end of the war, thus accounting for the totality of the German U-boat force. So not only did they fail, but they suffer a heavy cost for their failure. And that cost is no more apparent than for the U-boat crews, because being a member of a U-boat crew during World War II was one of the most dangerous things that you could do. And the fatality rates for the Union crews, U-boat crews, were extremely high. Can we go to the next slide, please? All right. And then a final myth that I kind of want to bust here and is the effectiveness of the convoys, and dispelling this notion that convoy after convoy after convoy crossed the Atlantic and were just decimated by U-boats. I know that's kind of an image that we have in popular culture, but again, when you look at the statistics, you realize that was not the case. While it's certainly true that certain convoys were hard hit, and that definitely happened, but the truth is that those were the rare exception. And what happened the majority of the time were most convoys crossed the Atlantic unscathed, and those convoys that did suffer losses, usually the losses were minimal. And I've had probably more pushback on that than about anything I've talked about. I had one guy literally call me a liar when I pointed this out, and I just produced the data. And I'm going to share some of the data with you right now. During the course of the Second World War, a total of 261,000 Allied merchant ships traveled to, from, or around the United Kingdom in convoys. Out of those 261,000 ships in those convoys, a total of 902 were sunk during the war. This constitutes a loss rate of 0.3%, or basically 1/3 of 1%. Even during the worst year in the war, which is 1942, the loss rate for convoys crossing the Atlantic was only 1.5%, which means that for every 75 ships that set out, 74 successfully made it to their destinations. So this is very much an endorsement of the effectiveness of the convoys in protecting the merchant ships during the Second World War. And again, it kind of dispels this notion. While it is true that certain convoys were hard hit, overall, the majority of them were able to proceed basically unimpeded, or at least with minimal losses. Now, in fairness, one other thing I'll just throw out there, though, in fairness, because in a sense we're comparing apples to oranges, during the periods of time when the Germans had their greatest successes, during the happy times, they were primarily operating against unconvoyed ships, both in the Atlantic in 1940 and then later off the American Eastern Seaboard. So again, this is an endorsement of the effectiveness of the convoys, because once they went into the convoys, those losses, were reduced significantly. Just something I like to point out, because amazingly, I get a lot of pushback on this. But again, when you look at the data, it's pretty conclusive. All right, and then the final slide here, I'm just kind of wrap things up. Again, as far as I'm concerned, the Atlantic campaign really was the quintessential maritime campaign of the Second World War, and it was really the most important campaign that was waged by the Western Allies during this conflict, because nothing else was possible without success in the maritime realm. And in the end of the day, and again, I think it's important to understand, in my mind, the Allies, in fact, made a major contribution to the eventual defeat of Germany. Not to take anything away, obviously, from the Soviet Union, but it was the Western Allies that were primarily responsible for the destruction of German air power. It was the Western Allies that were responsible almost exclusively for the destruction of German naval power. It was the Western Allies that conducted the strategic bombing campaign that impeded German industry and forced the Germans to divert massive resources to defensive applications. It was the Western Allies that attacked the German oil industry and basically denied German units the fuel that they needed to be effective. It was the Western Allies that drove Italy out of the war. It was the Western Allies that provided the Soviet Union with massive logistical support. And eventually it was the Western Allies that landed in Normandy and conducted the Northwest Europe campaign, which ultimately resulted in the conquest of 2/3 of Germany itself. And a sizable part of the German army that was destroyed by the Western Allies. So again, I don't think we should undermine the contributions that the Western Allies made to the defeat of Germany. And all of this was predicated upon success in the maritime realm.
And it's interesting, the sidebar has really kicked off since the work we discussed whether or not it's a crisis. And I think it's fascinating that's kind of piqued people's interest and debate, because as David O'Keefe, the renowned Canadian historian, says, whether it was a crisis or not, it was considered one at the time by enough people to make an effort to implement plans, to develop new technology, to improve the convoy system, to bring in the better radar, to use naval intelligence. And that's the point. And it's just that the minute we start using a word like crisis, that word has emotion behind it, has baggage behind it. Sure. And some people say it is appropriate to use it, and some will say it isn't appropriate to use it. And I think that's kind of a healthy discussion to do that. But the fact is, as you said, the data bears it out. The other comment I want to make, we will bring things to an end, is that, of course, we're talking about this from the point of view, or you're talking about this from the point of view of the data. The fact is, as someone said there, people living in Liverpool or Belfast and people whose husbands were on merchant ships, on convoys, that's the emotional aspect of things. Sure. That is very, very important to look at as well. And anyone who's been to other Commonwealth cemeteries and seen all the merchantmen who are listed, they're buried, and those listed on the monuments in the ports of Britain and Canada, we can't, even though that figure of 0.3% loss of ships, that doesn't take away the fact that many hundreds and thousands of men lost their lives. And so it's a fascinating conversation, and it's one kind of wants to do it without the emotion, but then one realizes you have to do it with the emotion. I often say on my tours in Normandy, there'll be time when I ask my groups to have their emotional hat on, like when you're going to a cemetery. Then there's other times you put on your analytical hat, and it's important to know when to switch from hat to hat, metaphorically speaking, and in my case, literally speaking. And I think that's the thing. It's very emotive when you start talking about the drama of the Atlantic, and people have relatives who serve there. A brilliant conversation. So I think we'll bring things to an end now. It's been lively sidebar there, and I will stress again, this is Brian's book, The Longest Campaign. It's a really great read. It's not massively enormous like some books that come out that are 800 pages. Very readable, very data driven, very factual, and I really enjoyed it, and it taught me a lot about the Battle Atlantic. So did you enjoy it, Brian?
Oh, I absolutely enjoyed it. I'm sitting here. I'm kind of oblivious to how much time has gone by. I just kind of looked down on the clock, and so I've been talking.
You've done an hour and a half. Yeah. No, but the Swiss scored a goal, but well, those of us. Some people are watching both. They're watching us and they're watching football. I'm being professional, and I will watch the second half. But it's a really interesting show, and it just has prompted people to say we should do a show about Allied submarines. We should do a show about Happy Time. We should do a show about this. Like everything else, this can be a starting point of going into more detail with yourself, with other people as well. It's but I think for people who don't know much about the Battle Atlantic, Lorelei, for example, and I think this is a really good starting point, a good solid starting point to then go on and read about it in greater detail. And thank you, David, for your job, for your comments. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Great Dominion, all the usual people for giving their incredible supporting information there. But right now, I will just remind people what got coming up, and I'll say goodbye to you in a second, Brian. So tomorrow night, we carry on with Battles at Sea Week. Mitch Weiss is joining me to talk about the loss of LCI 449 in Iwo Jima. Remember, that show was postponed from the Iwo Jima week back in February. That's tomorrow. Then we got Ian Ballantyne talking about the Bismarck on Friday. Drakenifel is talking about Convoy PQ-17 on Thursday. And Wednesday is John McKay talking about surviving the Arctic convoy. So that's the 5 shows we've got coming up today. But right now, it remains me to say thank you very much to Brian Walter for joining us.
Well, thank you.
And you can come back again and we'll do something in more detail, or we'll bring you on as part of a panel, or we'll focus on one aspect, whatever. We'll do that. But now,
my pleasure.
As usual, folks, don't forget to check out us on Patreon, Twitter. Brian's got a very active Facebook page as well. He's very active on some of the Battle Atlantic and War at Sea pages, so you can see some of Brian's work there. The link to Brian's website is below, or Facebook page is below. The link to Brian's book is below. Just go and get it. And of course, a reminder to read Mark Milner's excellent book on the Battle Atlantic as well, which is probably 30 years old now, but in many ways hasn't been surpassed, particularly from a Canadian point of view. I mean, there's lots of great books, but
sure.
Great book. Anyway, I'll close things off for tonight, and I will see you all again tomorrow to talk about Iwo Jima and LCI 449. Thanks for watching, everybody. I will see you all tomorrow. And good luck, France. Come on, France. Get one back. Cheers, everybody. Good night.